So Alejandro is going to lead us off with Pay for Delay, Preventing Competition in Pharmaceutical Markets.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Today I'm presenting the first chapter of my PhD thesis named Pay for Delay, Preventing Competition in Pharmaceutical Markets. Bear in mind that this is still work in progress. Now, let me open with a bold truth. We know that without rigorous antitrust scrutiny, pharmaceutical markets risk becoming innovation-proof monopolies where legal patents expire, but sometimes market power does not. We know that these markets are shaped by lots of variables. Firms invest a lot of money in research and development. They take good care of the timing when they launch a new molecule. And especially, they keep good care of protecting their patents and extending them as much as possible. One of such strategies is the so-called pay-for-delay agreement, in which a branded manufacturer pays the generic entrant in order to deter its entrance from the market. In other words, the generic manufacturer receives money so not to launch its own version of the drug in the market. According to the US Federal Trade Commission, these agreements cost an estimate of $3.5 billion per year to consumers. But this is an interesting thing because these agreements are becoming more and more complex over time, and the so-called cash agreements, which I just described, are becoming less common. And we are seeing, for instance, the so-called no authorized generic commitments, in which the originator of the drug or the branded manufacturer promises the first generic entrant not to launch its own generic version of the drug, so that the other generic manufacturer can hold the 6 months exclusivity in the generic segment. Now, I want to study this topic from 3 points of view. The first one is the health economics. We have lots of interesting papers. For instance, Margaret was speaking about the single market in pharmaceuticals, but I also build from the papers from Professor Morton, studying the probability of generics entering the market. Then I also want to contribute to the law point of view, in which we have Manganelli and Lemnos and Temnialov, who under certain different conditions, they study these pay-for-delay agreements under a theoretical model. Last but not least, I also contribute to this literature in the structural IO literature. My paper is quite similar to Duso and co-authors' paper studying the welfare effect of parallels import in Germany, but the methodology is pretty similar to Professors Boccari and Fournier paper. Now, the research question is quite simple, yet very difficult to answer. I would like to quantify the effects these pay-for-delay agreements have in pharmaceutical markets, both from the demand and the supply side. From the demand side point of view, I estimate what would have happened in absence of these agreements. In other words, what would have happened if generics had entered before into the market. This will be my counterfactual scenario and the exercise I perform in the paper. In the other side of the economy, I also study this from the supply point of view, and I try to assess the financial gains both branded and generic manufacturers have from entering these agreements. To do so, I studied the blockbuster drug Androgel, and let me give you a brief grasp of what this market looks like. So this drug is mainly used for testosterone replacement therapy, which is characterized by a problem that men face, which is named hypogonadism. When we face hypogonadism, we don't produce enough testosterone, and we need to take this therapy, namely by this gel named Androgel. Now, this gel was marketed by Solvay beginning in the 2000s, and it was a blockbuster drug because previously, when you needed to treat hypogonadism, you had to take vials, injectable vials to your body, in which you apply the testosterone through a needle to your body, which was very aggressive. However, this was the first drug that allowed you to take testosterone by means of a gel which you apply to your shoulders or to your body, and then you directly absorb testosterone. Now, this is highly relevant, not only because it had a large consumer base, and it still has, but it marked a landmark case in the antitrust world in the United States, namely the Federal Trade Commission versus Actavis case, in which the Supreme Court ruled that these agreements should be evaluated under a rule of reason. Or in other words, each agreement should be seen one by one, and the pro-competitive effects of each agreement should be greater than the anti-competitive effects of the agreement. Now let's take a narrower look at this drug and this particular market. Let me explain you very briefly the timeline of this drug. As I said, in the 2000, Solvay began marketing Androhel, and it quickly became a blockbuster drug. In the 2003, however, Actavis and other generic firms filed the so-called Paragraph 4 challenge under the Hatch-Waxman Act, trying to enter the market. For some years, Actavis and Solvay litigated, going back and forth, until 2006, where the Food and Drug Administration in the US gave permission to generics to enter the market. Instead of entering the market, what we observed is that these generic firms trying to enter the market abandoned the Paragraph 4 challenge, and according to the Federal Trade Commission, they received huge amounts of money from Solvay, namely, in order to not enter the market and delay its entry until 2015. Now, in 2009, the Federal Trade Commission sued Actavis and the other generics in this market because of being involved in a pay-for-delay illegal agreement. The case was remanded through 2 lower district courts until it arrived to the Supreme Court in 2013, where the Supreme Court ruled that these agreements should be evaluated under a rule of reason. Finally, in 2015, we observed that generic entry finally occurs. The story I want to tell here is that, as economists, we have a framework in which we observe a delay period of 9 years in which generics should have entered before into the market, but they didn't. So in some sense, what we have is 2 worlds. The world in which generics are not in the market and there is presumably a legal delay, and the world where generics enter and then we observe competition. Using these 2 worlds, we can construct a counterfactual scenario and assess the damages of these agreements. Now let's move into the data. The data I have is from Bloomberg Symphony Health, and I have weekly sales and revenues in the United States from January 29 to November 23. Unfortunately, I don't have the gold standard IMS data because of resources, but still I can do a very good counterfactual scenario with this time frame in the data. I observed several characteristics for each drug: the drug name, strength, size, the indicator, whether the drug is branded or generic, and the form. Now, the market is divided in 4 main molecules of the testosterone in different forms. As I said, the first main form is injectable vials, which was the most aggressive one, and then the other 4 remaining forms are the ones you put into your body through the transdermal via. Now let's take a narrower look at the picture of the market. Here I want to emphasize something that hasn't been raised yet in this conference, but the structure of this market shows what one could expect to be the so-called generics paradox, in which generics slowly increase their price, in which the branded manufacturer slowly increase their price in response to generic entry. The idea of this is that branded manufacturers increase their price to capture the inelastic part of the market and the loyal segment of customers before generics enter the market. Androhel is present in topical gel pump and transdermal gel packet, and what we can see is that some years prior to generic entry, indicated by the black dashed line, the price slightly increases. You might have noticed that here there's a form missing, which I needed another slide to show, which is vials injectable. And this one shows a huge disproportional spike increase in price for the branded drugs, which makes us think that this market cross-form is more regulated, more correlated, than one might think. Because even though generic competition was happening already in the 2009 and before, the branded manufacturer increases their price probably in response to generics entering in other segments of the market. Now, this cross-form correlation is what drives to my methodology, and I don't want to delve a lot in what I'm doing here, but basically I'm solving this equation linearly. It's pretty standard, and I'm estimating the demand with respect to an outside option. I have the price coefficient and the characteristics of the drug. I have size and strength only due to my data set. However, the interesting part here is that I use the Verboven framework, in which I nest drugs according to some of their characteristics. As I've said before, I assume that there is some cross-form correlation, and this sigma 2 over here indicates the nesting level across forms. So therefore, I allow for some correlation between forms. Then the sigma 1 is basically the second level of nest, which is the drug indicator. Again, here I am allowing for some correlation between the generic and the branded indicator within its particular form. That's why it's the two-level nested Loist model. Now, I'm using the usual BLP style instrument, so no need to talk there. But the cool thing about this is that this model allows me to compute elasticities and consumer surplus and get a better picture of what's happening in the market. Moreover, this allows me to compute the counterfactual that I will explain later on. Now moving to the supply side, this is pretty standard in the structural I/O literature. As I said, I don't observe marginal cost, so I define a profit function for each multi-product firm, which is based on the price, the marginal cost, the share of the firm, and then the market size and minus the fixed cost. If I take the first order condition and apply some derivations, which is in equation 3, I can apply some derivations and arrive to equation 4, in which I isolate the marginal cost as a function of the price, the quantity, and the observed markup. And then I can back out marginal costs. Now let's move to the interesting part of the paper, which is the counterfactual. As an economist, I face this problem, and I say, what would have happened under two scenarios? The first scenario is asking myself what would have happened if generics had never entered the market. This is the so-called no-entry scenario. I'm not showing this in the presentation, but you can find it in the paper. The most interesting counterfactual is the second one, which is what would have happened if generics had entered earlier in the market. This is the no delay scenario. In other words, what would have happened without the delay. To do so, I artificially augment the choice set in all periods previous to the observed generic entry in the status quo. How do I do so? I take the first 8 generic products that enter the market in the status quo and artificially put them in markets prior to generic entry. In other words, markets prior to 2015. The products chosen are the 8 ones, which I cannot show because I have no pointer, but it doesn't matter. But they were chosen in basis of 2 reasons. First, they were the first generics entering in the market in the status quo. And second, the 8 generic products introduced in the counterfactual were all involved in the pay-for-delay agreement. Now, I compute an algorithm in order to recompute the market structure under the new equilibrium, and it's quite simple, following more or less the Hausmann style. First, I take the mean utility of each product, accounting for product characteristics. This is, I keep the characteristics of the product the same as observed in the status quo. I keep the marginal cost at their post-mean introduction level. This is, I keep the marginal cost as observed. And the prices. Then I recompute the predicted market shares using the nested logic structure. Then using the system of first order optimality condition in equation 4 of previous slide, I get the Bertrand-Nash equilibrium prices in vector form. And then I keep iterating this until I get convergence of the price vector. Now let's move to the results. Very briefly, to show you the demand estimation results, I use product, time, and molecule fixed effects. And results are quite standard. As I add nesting into my model, the price coefficient becomes more negative. And when I use instrument, the price coefficient becomes even more negative, which means that my instruments are good. Now, size doesn't seem to play a big role in this market, but strength seems to play a positive role. And the important thing here is that sigma 1 and sigma 2 are both bounded between 0 and 1. And sigma 1 is greater than sigma 2 always, which is needed for consistent utility maximization. For the purpose of the counterfactual, I will use the third specification, the two-nested logic with instrumental variables. Now let's move to the interesting part, which are the results of the counterfactual. In this table, what we see are three relevant forms in the market. The first two are the forms where Androgel is involved, and the last one is a form where something odd is happening, but I want to discuss it. In the first form, where Androgel was involved, we see that when we introduce prices into the market, when we introduce generic products into the market, prices decrease roughly by a half. In some sense, I'm claiming that this is the causal effect or the causal damage of pay-for-delay agreements, because if the delay wasn't held, consumers could have enjoyed prices that were roughly half than they were in the status quo. In the second row, we can see transdermal gel packet, which is another form where Androgel was involved. We can see that mean prices decreased by more or less 3%, which is not quite a lot. However, the interesting thing here is that branded prices increase in response to generic entry. Again, this might be correlated to the so-called generic paradox, in which branded prices increase their price in response to generic entry. Same thing happens for injectable vials, which were competing very aggressively in prices in the status quo. However, when generics enter the market in other forms, remember that Androgel was not in the vials injectable segment, prices spike dramatically. This might be, again, to the cross-form correlation that I've pointed before in the market. If we take a narrower look at what is happening here, let's see the mean prices for the topical gel pump segment where Androgel was involved. In blue, we see the original line where around 2011 prices start slowly increasing, reflecting again the generic paradox thing. However, for the branded and generic simulated prices under the counterfactual, prices collapse to a mean of 6, 7 more or less. What I claim is that the difference between the lower bound and the blue line, the lower bound of the two lines and the blue line, is the causal effect of pay-for-delay agreements. Again, what we see here is that if products would have entered before into the market, consumers would have enjoyed lower prices in this segment where Androgel was involved. Now, what I've shown here is that these agreements really undermine the core mechanism of pharmaceutical competition. Firms seek to extend their patent as much as they can, and they engage to these some sort of dark strategies to extend their monopoly power. And in response, they delay consumer access to more affordable generic alternative. I want to give food for thought here, and of course, regulators should focus on price levels, which is important, as shown here, but also on market timing. And I want to connect this with the presentation that Margaret gave before. I think, in some sense, we need to increase the transparency requirements for these paragraph 4 settlements, because when we see a firm abandoning a paragraph 4 challenge, especially when they already won this challenge, there must be a reason behind. Bear in mind that generics in the 2003 won the case, in the 2006, won the paragraph 4 challenge, and they could have entered the market. However, they didn't because of this pay-for-delay agreement. Now, to wrap up everything, this case illustrates how these illegal agreements delay access to cheaper medications. By using a structural framework, what I do is simulate the world where the delay never happened. Prices for some products could have been reduced by roughly 50%, especially in relevant forms where Androgel was present. Of course, consumer surplus would have been substantially higher in this case. I want to give a note here, and the idea is that this is not just a particular case. This is not just cherry picking of Androgel. I took this case because I observed both worlds, and it's a very interesting case. But this really keeps happening, especially, as I said in the introduction, with different forms of compensation, which makes it even harder for antitrust authorities to conduct, to analyze these cases. For instance, in Europe, we've seen roughly 5 years ago that the Teva Cephalon case led to a 60.5 million fine for delaying the generic for delaying the generic entry of the modafinil version. In the United States, very recently, we've seen the Jazz Hikma case, which has very recently has been settled by paying a $145 million fine. Now I want to wrap up this by saying that these are not just legal concerns, which we need to take care, but this is not just a legal problem. They are really costly for public health systems and consumers. And this should remain still a priority for competition authorities because this still keeps happening. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Thanks. I think we can take a couple of questions. Marty? Why don't you just go for it?
Sorry.
I can chop it into people online.
I know,
I
good.
think is the problem.
Yeah.
That I think.
Thanks, Peter. So I agree with your broad policy conclusion. That makes eminent sense. But just a couple small detail questions. For your counterfactual simulation, is the branded manufacturer rationally anticipating entry by generics throughout both in the pre and post period? That's one. And second, in terms of generic entry, do you have, is that equilibrium entry or is it just an arbitrary number? Because both those things could alter. I'd be very surprised if qualitatively it would alter your policy conclusion, but it could change actually what the numbers are in the simulations.
Could you please repeat the first question again?
I'm sorry?
Could you please repeat the first question?
The first question, does the branded manufacturer anticipate entry by generics
Okay.
in the counterfactual?
Yeah, short answer, no, because this is not a dynamic game. It's just static, and I don't apply any dynamics.
Because that might move those numbers down.
Of course. No, this is just a static game in which I take the 8 generics, as I described, introduce them into the market, and see what happens statically. No anticipation. And then for the second question, no, I don't apply any equilibrium here. So this is just arbitrary, or in other words, what I observed in the data, because the model is as it is. I took the discrete choice because I think your question goes in the line that one could think, okay, Alejandro, you have the perfect setting for a diff-in-diff estimation in which, okay, you just compute damages and then you are done. This is true, I could do that, but I think it's very interesting to perform this counterfactual exercise in which I can claim better the causal effect of this agreement by introducing the generics in the market. But still, I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Okay. And then I think this has to be the last question, so we move on to.
Thanks.
Yeah.
More of a comment than a question, but given the data you have in terms of price and quantity in your counterfactual, you could probably calculate the counterfactual profits. It would be interesting, I think, to see how that differed from the actual profit share arrangement they had from the pay for delay. Did the firms get it correct when they were doing the pay for delay agreement, which I imagine you'd have in the settlement or the case data?
Yeah, so that's a very great point. I've just done this like the last week, and first results show that the pay for delay firms under the counterfactual scenario get really low profits compared to the status quo. So yeah, this is pointing towards, again, more or less the same result, right? Yeah, but this is still a work in progress, so I'm taking that into account. But yeah, I will compute that. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.